The committee will come to order. Mr. Dodaro, we'll shortly have other individuals coming back, but I thought I'd take a moment. I guess it would be considered nonpartisan since it's just you and me. The healthcare.gov website, in combination with the other parts of the Affordable Care Act, some 30-some separate websites that were done by 30-some separate states at a cost, or let me rephrase that, a grant of no less than $100 million and sometimes over $300 million apiece. Have you looked into, if you will, the cost and duplication involved in that?
We have been asked by a number of parties in the Congress to look at healthcare.gov, a lot of aspects of it, and also the State websites, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman. So we will be looking at those issues, both in terms of how they were designed and what kind of investment policies, testing that they did. And while we haven't been asked to specifically look at the potential for overlap and duplication, you raise a good point. So I'll make sure that we look at that aspect of it as we cover this issue. I thank you for raising that.
Well, and I appreciate it. You've got a big job in looking at all aspects of that, and I wanted to make sure that we did not look at it, the Affordable Care Act and healthcare.gov and the other sites, as an event that we can do anything about. The money is spent, the history is written. But legislatively, this committee would have the authority to prohibit grants if they were redundant. And so as you're looking at, if you will, this propensity to give everyone a little bit of buy-in money, which there were plenty of costs that could have been provided in grants. But in this case, the building of IT, when clearly once you got to the second state and the third state and the fourth state, any level of duplication was pure waste. And in the case of, for example, Maryland versus Kentucky versus other states, we also have this odd situation in which you have failures and successes, in some cases, just because they didn't know what the other entity was doing. So as you look at it in a mind to a proposed legislative fix that would prohibit any future government in any area, not just health care or something as this example, from issuing grants that would duplicate in state after state without a justification. Sometimes there are justifications, but without a specific justification, because I believe that this was well intended, but if anyone had sat down and said you're going to spend over $5 billion to produce essentially duplicate copies of websites that all do the same thing, they would have said, my goodness, we can spend $3 or $4 billion of those dollars somewhere else and do better. So I would appreciate that. Who's next? I will now, as I said, go to Dr. Gosar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you very, very much, Mr. Dodaro. A couple things, statements. Compared to Fannie and Freddie Mac, FHA saw about a 4 to 6% lower returns on disposition of foreclosed properties and took 60% longer to dispose of those properties, average of 340 days versus 200 days. And there's a number of things that Fannie and Freddie do that FHA does not do. So can you put up slide number 1 for me? There we go. FHA real estate-owned properties perform behind Fannie and Freddie. GAO analysis shows that FHA REOs properties are 4 to 6% behind there. How does this affect, when it takes FHA about 60% longer to sell an REO property, how does this affect FHA's performance to get rid of that property in disposition?
I'll ask Mr. Brown to respond.
It impacts the return on the property. So it's the amount of how much they actually spend and then actually how much they get back. So it affects their overall return on the property.
Yeah, but if we would have followed Fannie and Freddie in that same disposition, we could have seen as much as $400 million in costs incurred, but saved as much as $600 million.
Yes.
Seems like a very good balance line, wouldn't it be?
Excuse me?
It would be a very good balance line?
Yes.
Yeah. How does FHA's disposition process differ from the disposition process of the enterprises or the private industry?
We found that it differs in a couple of areas. One, it differs on the front end when FHA actually takes possession of the property and starts the sale process, the management and the sale. It also differs in terms of how they go about getting their initial sale price on the property. FHA tends to go with a single price. The enterprises and VA tend to get a number of prices to come up with a sale price. They also differ in terms of how they reduce the sales price if a property's been on the market for a while. FHA takes an approach that they have a price and they will reduce the sale price of the property the same regardless of where that property exists in the country. The enterprises and VA will take a different approach. They will actually consider market factors in terms of reducing the price of a sales property.
And don't the other entities also look at maintaining and
Yes.
changing that out? And that's a big deal, isn't it?
Yes.
And what prohibits the FHA from doing that? What's one of the prohibitive factors in maintenance and improving the lot?
Well, we aren't aware of anything that prohibits them from doing that. It's something that we recommended that they take a look at in terms of the difference in their properties and the others. FHA indicated that in their comments back to us that they weren't sure that that would actually increase their ability if they did certain minimal maintenance.
I want to stop you there because we got limited time. In the GAO's June 2013 report, HUD reported that compliance with Davis-Bacon made it difficult to engage in projects. To make necessary repairs to increase sale returns, Fannie and Freddie do not need to comply with Davis-Bacon. So there is another aspect, is there not?
Well, there are costs associated with it, but when we did our analysis, we actually controlled for geographic differences in terms of, so if you're dealing with a different geography and the labor associated with maintaining a property in one community versus another, those were controlled for in terms of how the enterprises fared versus FHA.
Well, then why don't other entities cite that barrier? I mean, it seems that if we're recreating the wheel, we ought to look at the wheel prior to that, wouldn't we?
Yes.
I mean, Davis-Bacon is riddled with fraud, right?
Well, in that 2013 report, we didn't drill in on Davis-Bacon issues.
Well, I mean, maybe we should, because in that GAO report, it actually showed that the calculations for Davis-Bacon were 100% fraudulent. 100%.
In the 2013 report?
And 2012, I'm sorry.
GAO's 2012 report?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, just a mere calculation from the Department of Wages and Labor and moving it to the Bureau of Statistics, GAO hardly likes Davis-Bacon, do they?
This body of work didn't focus on Davis-Bacon. It could be another body within GAO.
Well, I mean, when you start looking at some of the implications, particularly on buildings and maintenance of buildings and increasing aptitude, this is a barrier. And it cites it that this is a barrier. And we ought to be looking at this because CBO says that if we just change the calculations, we could save between $10 and $25 billion a year just by calculating Davis-Bacon properly. And part of the problem with utilizing Davis-Bacon is there's no transparency. No one knows how it's calculated. And so that would make it very easy for us to see an increase in sales and looking at the taxpayers' dollars a little bit better.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that issue.
Okay. I've run out of time, so I will yield back to the Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes himself for questions. It's always good to have Mr. Doris. This is the part for me as a freshman and the meetings we have. One, I love the reports that you have and the reports we put out. We talked about this last year. I'm in the military. That part on military uniforms is just like, it is, again, unfathomable in most comprehensive approaches, especially when you look at it from a position of other things that we need. And I think when you spend those dollars in certain ways, it just presents an issue for many of us as we look at this and say, why do we have these duplication of products? Why do we have these services? Why are these things not being done? So in that line, I've got some things I want to talk to you about and then some issues that I think maybe from the Chairman's earlier comments today and many others' earlier comments, how do we get to fixing this? I'm about, for my district, we're about fixing issues. We're about fixing problems and finding them. I did not come to Washington to be a spotlight and simply shine a light and say, here's a problem, well, there's another problem, I think we've got to come, and I think one of the ways we rebuild trust with the American people is we say, here's a problem, here's how we fix it. Here's a problem, here's how we fix it. So let's, in looking at that, I do have a couple of questions for you. As I understand it, the GAO started issuing these reports in 2011, and I want to know how many of these recommendations have been fully addressed?
Of the over 389 specific actions that we've made, 123 have been fully addressed, so it's about a third.
Okay, would that be fully addressed?
Yes.
Completely. So from what we're gathering, it's about 19%. So
well, it depends on. There's 162 areas.
Right.
All right. If you take the areas, that's about 19%.
Okay.
20 of the areas. But if you go down to the specific actions, it's a little bit more.
Well, and again, that's what we're looking for is completed action. I know there's a lot that have partial actions, other things like that, but I'm looking at completed because when you look at this, this is to explain this back home. When you go home and you see these, or they take the GAO report, because I've got a lot of folks in the 9th District of Georgia that look at these reports, they see them put out, and they say, well, why can't you do this? And we say, well, that's just, somebody, they'll hear, well, that's just a little bit. Well, it means a lot.
Right.
This $100 million here, $100 million there, that's actually real money in the state of Georgia, and especially in the 9th District. So they don't understand how we can't do this or come together. I recall the words of Senator Coburn. He came before this committee just a few months ago, and he said that he never dreamed that the GAO would republish these reports and Congress wouldn't embrace all their recommendations. He said that he thought that these reports would embarrass Congress into action. It's not the GAO's fault. It's Congress's inability to address these types of issues. And that's the reason that I'm going to, in just a few days, introduce the Commission on Accountability and Review of Federal Agencies, the CARFA Act. This is not new. We've made some changes to it, but we're bringing it back up. This will establish a results-oriented bipartisan commission made up of 7 official members appointed by the President and Congress, 1 each appointed by the majority and minority leaderships of both houses, and then 3 appointed by the President, as well as 4 non-voting ex officio members, members of Congress, 2 from each house. The Commission's charge will be to recommend, 1, realignment where a function can be performed by 2 or more agencies or programs and can be consolidated, realignment or elimination of any agency or program that has wasted Federal funds, and 3, elimination of any agency or program that has completed its purpose, become irrelevant, or failed to meet its objectives. Any savings that result from the consolidation or cancellation of programs will be applied to offset the cost of the Commission for deficit reduction. The findings and suggestions of this Commission will have privileged status before the House and the Senate, and this is important, and will be considered in their entirety without amendment, which, by forcing Congress to vote up or down on a Commission's recommendations, the congressional log rolling that normally protects spending and waste can be circumvented and backroom deals become much less effective. Farm Bill negotiations of the USDA's duplicative catfish inspection program point to this perfectly. In 2012, Senator McCain and Kerry offered an amendment to the Farm Bill, which was approved by voice vote. The GAO, your organization, included this program in its list of duplicative programs in the 2013 report. I remember you and I having this discussion last year. I couldn't understand. Like I said, you inspect catfish my place, you catch them, you inspect them, you put them in the bucket. Okay? There's bigger issues, I know, but we've got a protection issue going on. In the most recent Farm Bill, there was considerable effort by a vast majority of members in Congress to repeal this program. Unfortunately, due to the effects of several influential members, the program was included in the bill and another defeat for government efficiency. CARFA is designed specifically to address issues like this one. So in not only urging members who are watching now or listening their salary mission to become a co-sponsor on this, I would like to talk with you just a moment about actually looking at these recommendations and how we can work together. Comment on Mr. Coburn's discussion when he said that he thought it would embarrass us into action. And really, just on a more of a personal level, has it surprised you the lack of inaction on these items?
At one level, at one level, I've been concerned that there hasn't been enough movement of legislation that's been introduced. I mean, it's not, in many of these areas, legislation has been introduced and has, in some cases, advanced, but it hasn't been passed. Even in cases where the President also agrees and has submitted it in the budget proposal. So where there's broad agreement and legislation has been introduced between, certain parties in the Congress and the President, yes, I have been surprised that there haven't been quicker action when those circumstances present themselves. On areas where we've pointed out multiple programs across multiple agencies and that touch upon many different parts of the executive branch, and various committee jurisdictions, no, I haven't been that surprised that there hasn't been fast action on those areas. So it's kind of mixed depending upon the areas. There are a lot of areas I would consider to be very straightforward and broad agreement. There I'm perplexed as to why there hasn't been more action. But in some of the more entrenched areas where there are constituencies and longstanding Federal programs and interests and interest groups and others, I'm quite frankly not surprised that more hasn't happened.
Well, I think that's a concern for all of us, and maybe one of the reasons why we're addressing this is because Congress hasn't acted. We've come up with enough reasons. You hear enough speeches about cut this, cut that, and well, it never happens. And it sounds more like my excuses for my children not cleaning their rooms at this point. With that, I will yield to the gentleman from Arizona for 5 minutes.
I'm going to continue where I left off. So in 202, GAO recommended that HUD establish unified property custody as a priority for FHA. Now, more than a decade later, FHA still does not have consistent custody over the foreclosed properties. Today's report indicates there is still bifurcated ownership. What benefits may FHA see if it establishes a unified property custody?
Well, we think it will lead to quicker action in disposing of the properties.
Yes.
I think I would agree with you. And why hasn't FHA actually taken and implemented this recommendation?
Yeah, Congressman, in preparing for this hearing, I asked myself a lot of those same questions. I've asked my staff to elevate this issue within the Federal Housing Administration, and I do plan to follow up myself personally with Secretary of HUD about why they haven't taken more action on these areas. I'm quite frankly surprised along the lines of the previous question.
Is there any other things that GAO would tell FHA that they would help in implementation?
We have highlighted a number of alternative approaches, and the one you mentioned being one. And FHA, for the first time, has started to begin to look at some alternatives to dealing with REO, and we actually think the one you mentioned would be transformative for the program if it were to actually look at the whole unified custody approach.
Gotcha. I'm going to now refocus. Being a dentist, I'm going to go back to defense healthcare contracting. The report issued today identifies contracting for the defense healthcare professionals as an area of fragmentation in the Federal Government. The central issue is a lack of consolidated agency-wide strategy to contract for healthcare professionals. Can you explain the efforts the Army, Navy, and other components within DoD and what they've made to remedy the problem that is this widespread fragmentation?
Yes. I'll ask Paul Francis, who's head of our acquisition services, to elaborate. But part of the problem, Congressman, is that there's not any effort to coordinate across the services. I mean, and even we found some efforts within the individual services to coordinate among themselves within the Army, Air Force, and Navy. And neither of those efforts were very effective, and there wasn't any effort across the services to do so. Paul?
Yes, sir. What we found was in contracting for medical health care professionals at DoD's facilities, I think there was $1.1 billion in contracting. We found about only 8% of that was for where two services got together and consolidated the requirements. Even when a single service was doing the contracting, they would award multiple contracts for the same type of people in the same facility. And I think the issue is with the Federal Government in contracting, if you run your competition and you have a pretty good contract, you seem happy. But that's just not good enough. So these contracts are competed. They're good instruments and so forth, but the government needs to do more, to do like private industry. So you need to be looking for your best deal. So while the Army, for example, might have 10 really good contracts for 10 different things, maybe it should have one contract for 10 things.
Is there a way, from your viewpoint, that we could get the military to actually get this taken care of and done, and actually implement contracting unified across the board?
Yes. Now, there's a couple of things. There's a new Defense Health Agency that says it's going to take that up, but we're still waiting. And there's been a subcontract group that's supposed to deal with it as well. But I think Congress could create incentives. One would be do something with the money. If you think savings are available, maybe you could lower the budget by that amount and create an incentive for them to consolidate those contracts.
Part of the problem, even though we have power of the purse, is actually trying to get a budget passed. I mean, I'm a dentist impersonating a politician, and to see what goes on in this place is just absolutely ludicrous. So maybe a commission, maybe there's a mixture of past or retired military, as well as some business folks. Could a commission like that actually have some benefit?
It could, although I'd say it's been, I don't think there's any question about the problem. People agree it's not that efficient, it has been studied. And I think people know what to do about it. It's the point you made. The actual taking of action is not, that's what's not happening.
Yeah,
Well, see,
Congressman, we've recommended in the past that there be a chief management official over at the department. In this case, and like many of the cases, people we talk within the department agree with us. They just can't be organized enough to focus on the implementation of the program. So congressional oversight and control of the funds within the department is really the only way to do it. In many of these areas, there have been commissions in the past and the studies, and my feeling is that other commissions will have marginal effect, that you really need to focus on and hold the people in the department accountable for focusing in on this if you really want some action done.
Well, and that gets back to my aspects of that we have a lawless society in Washington, D.C., because we can't even get a compliance with a subpoena by the Attorney General of the United States. So that's also problematic, and that's another subject for another day, actually Thursday. So, but I thank you very, very much. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Yeah, the gentleman brings up a great point, though, and I think, and just listening to you, what we're saying is I love what these words are. We are still waiting. You made it just a second ago. How many times have we come into this room, and that's one of the things we're still waiting, or I don't remember, or we're getting to it, or we're still waiting, or the report hadn't come out yet, and yet when you come inside basically the Beltway, the only area in the world right now, especially in the U.S. over the last few years, that is actually building, growing, and producing something which is not widgets, but they're jobs to do the things that we're talking about here, in areas in which hurt business, they don't do things efficiently, they change things. That's why I believe the commission we're proposing, and again, I'm not by any illusion, I was in Georgia in the Appropriations Committee. Appropriators, this is an area where we should be doing some of this. We're not doing it now. Not an indictment on anyone. I think it's just the politics of it. So we're actually putting together your up or down vote, a BRAC-style vote. You put this up, there's going to be some things that may not like, but you'll find the common agreement stuff. Not, you're not going to get a report from a bipartisan commission that is going to have these things that most people don't agree with. We're looking at this, and it also is 6 years and takes each appropriations bill two each year. So you're going through the whole appropriations bill process in 6 years. And then at the end, it has a provision in which GAO will do a report to look at what actually happened in this process. So as we look at this, I think the other issue is getting control of the budget in and of itself. And you said, areas like this where we find this, why should these still be rewarded? And I think those are the things we're going to look at, my office is looking at, is to say, if we see it in the report, well, then we need to make an amendment in the appropriations process to undoubtedly you don't need this anymore. That's the one thing I think that we can continue on. That's one thing this committee needs to continue to be a part of, because the American people, if there's one thing true, they're simply tired of saying, we're still waiting. They can't wait on their jobs. They can't wait on their businesses. And Washington needs to do the same. So with that, I see no one else. I'd like to thank the witnesses for taking his time from his busy schedule to appear before us today.